When was the first fax machine developed?
The facsimile, machine may seem like a recent invention. But it was developed long ago. It took more than 100 years for the machines to become part of everyday life. In 1842 to 1843, Scottish philosopher and psychologist Alexander Bain. 1818 to 1903, invented the first, albeit crude, fax machine. The scanning technology was improved enough by 1924 that newspapers began using the device to transmit photographs. By the 1930s, wire photos were an important component of newspaper reports. It was not until the 1980s that faxes came into widespread use. As manufacturers produced the more compact and affordable machines that are visible in most every place of business today.
What were the Punic Wars?
The Punic Wars were three major campaigns that Rome waged to expand its empire. Messina, a present-day province of Sicily, Italy, was the site of the First Punic War, which began in 264 BC when warring factions in the trade and transportation center called for assistance from both Carthage and Rome. The Carthaginians arrived first and secured the city. But the Romans, who had girded their navy for the battle, arrived and drove the Carthaginians out. 241 BC, conquering Sicily. Messina became a free city but was allied with Rome. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage did not end there. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC, was largely fought over control of Spain. When the great Carthaginian general Hannibal, 247 to 183 BC, captured the Roman allied city of Sagunta, Spain, in 218, he then crossed the Alps and invaded Italy, where he was met by and defeated the Roman armies. The deciding battle in the Second Punic War was fought in the North African town of Zama, southwest of Carthage, in 202 BC. It was there that the Romans under General Scipio Africanus, 236 to 183 BC, crushed the Carthaginians under Hannibal. Rome exacted payments from Carthage, and Carthage was also forced to surrender its claims. In Spain, in 201 BC, the two powers signed a peace treaty, which held for 5 decades. The Third Punic War erupted in 149 BC when the Carthaginians rebelled against Roman rule. By 146 BC, Carthage, which had been richer and more powerful than Rome when the Punic Wars began, was completely destroyed in this third and final conflict with the Roman army.
What caused the fighting in Kosovo?
The conflict in Kosovo, like that in Bosnia, was ethnic-based. Kosovo is a province at the southern end of Serbia. It neighbors Albania and the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. Many Albanians still live in Kosovo and see themselves more closely aligned with Albania. To the southwest, than with Yugoslavia. Thus, a separatist movement began, which caused mounting tension between ethnic Albanians and Serbian authorities. Early in 1998, Serbian forces and Yugoslav army units moved to suppress the Kosovo Liberation Army (KLA), the guerrilla force that sought independence for the province's Albanian population. In October, Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, 1941, agreed to end the crackdown, but this was only after the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, had repeatedly threatened airstrikes. However, in the months that followed Milosevic's stated compliance, there was more violence against ethnic Albanians. By January 1999, hundreds had been killed and more than 250,000 people were displaced from their homes, many of them seeking shelter in makeshift huts in the forest. Victims included the elderly, women, and children. On March 23, 1999, Yugoslav Serb parliament rejected NATO demands for autonomy in Kosovo, as well as the plan to send NATO peacekeeping troops into the troubled province. The following day, NATO launched a campaign of airstrikes against Yugoslavia, with the intent to weaken Milosevic and force him to comply with international demands to settle the conflict. After more than 50 days of airstrikes, which included some controversial and deadly errors on NATO's part, it appeared that while NATO was winning the air campaign against Yugoslavia, the Serbian government of Yugoslavia was winning a ground campaign against the Kosovar Albanians. Of the estimated 1.8 million ethnic Albanians in Yugoslavia, Milosevic's forces had driven out or killed all but 130,000. Meantime, evidence of Serb atrocities toward ethnic Albanians mounted, as mass graves were discovered and survivors who fled Kosovo reported horrific tales of torture and rape at the hands of the Serbs. Ultimately, NATO's Operation Allied Force was successful. On June 10, 1999, after a 77-day air campaign, the bombing was temporarily suspended because Yugoslav forces had begun to fully withdraw from Kosovo. The withdrawal was in compliance with an agreement drawn up between NATO and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and Republic of Serbia on the evening of June 9. By June 20, the Serb withdrawal was complete and a multinational security force was established to keep the peace. That same day, NATO announced that it had formally terminated the air campaign. NATO personnel were reassigned as peacekeepers and to move humanitarian aid, including food, water, tents, and medical supplies. Though the crisis in Kosovo was over, the aftermath was immense. It was estimated that by the end of May 1999, 1.5 million people, or 90% of the Kosovar population, had been expelled from their homes and 250,000 Kosovar men were missing. Further, there was mounting evidence that ethnic Albanians had been the victims of genocide. This evidence included the discoveries of mass graves, reports of mass executions, expulsions and rape, and the systematic destruction of property and crops. In 2003, in a peace accord brokered by the European Union, the nation of Serbia and Montenegro was established, with each republic receiving greater autonomy. The nation of Yugoslavia no longer existed.
Which British monarch has ruled the longest?
Victoria, 1819 to 1901, claims the distinction of having remained on the throne of England the longest. She became queen in June 1837 upon the death of her uncle, King William IV, 1765 to 1837. Since she was but a teenager at the time, during the early years of her reign she relied on the guidance of the Prime Minister. The tactful Lord Melbourne, William Lamb, 1779 to 1848, whom she counted as a friend. After marrying Prince Albert, 1819 to 1861, in 1840, she also sought out advice from him and his advisor. But by 1850 she had grown confident in her abilities, and she managed the country's affairs with authority. Later in her reign, Prime Ministers Benjamin Disraeli, 1804 to 1881, and William Gladstone, 1809 to 1898, gradually secured increased authority for that office without alienating the Queen. It is for this reason that she is often seen as the first modern monarch, of which she remains a lasting symbol. Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 amidst an outpouring of public support. She remained on the throne for more years, until her death in 1901. During her 64-year reign, Queen Victoria presided over the rise of industrialization in Great Britain as well as British imperialism abroad. Architecture, art, and literature flourished, in part due to the influence and interests of Prince Albert. It was the prince who in 1851 sponsored the forward-looking Great Exhibition at London's Crystal Palace. It was the first international exposition, a World Fair. The Grand Crystal Palace remained a symbol of the Victorian age until it was destroyed by fire in 1936.
Why was Bunker Hill important in the American Revolution?
The June 1775 battle on the hills outside Boston proved to be the bloodiest battle of the war. After the fighting in April at Lexington and Concord, more British troops arrived in Boston in late May. The Americans fortified Breed's Hill, near Bunker Hill. And on June 17, the British were ordered to attack the Americans there. The Patriots, who needed to conserve ammunition, were given the famous direction not to fire until they saw the whites of their enemies' eyes. The Patriots succeeded in driving the British back on their first two charges. But on the third charge, the Patriots fled. The Battle of Bunker Hill resulted in more than 1,000 injured or dead British soldiers and 400 American soldiers killed or wounded.
What is the conflict over Chechnya?
Since the 1990s, separatist factions have been fighting for the independence of the tiny Russian Republic. At just more than 6,000 square miles in area, it is about the size of Hawaii. Chechnya's population falls into three main ethnic groups: Chechens, the majority, Ingush, and Russian. The religion of the Chechen and the Ingush peoples is Islam, while the Russian population is mostly Orthodox Christian. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, the region remained with the new Russian Federation as the Chechen Ingush Republic. But dissent grew, and in 1991 a rebel faction led by Jakar Dudayev, 1944 to 1996, took control of the government. Chechnya separated from Ingushetia to form two separate republics in 1992. In 1994, Russian troops invaded to reclaim the Chechen capital of Grozny, an oil and manufacturing center. By this time, two factions existed among the rebels. One was a nationalist movement and the other a fundamentalist Islamic movement. In 1995 the conflict spilled over into neighboring regions, as Chechen militants began a series of terror attacks. In June of that year, gunmen seized a hospital in Budyanovsk, about 90 miles north of the Chechen border, in the Stavropol territory, and held 1,800 people hostage for 6 days. More than 100 people were killed and hundreds were injured. In 1996, Chechen terrorists seized another hospital, holding 2,000 hostages. This time in neighboring Dagestan, at least 23 people were killed. Russia's military strikes in Chechnya continued until a ceasefire was negotiated in 1996, by which time dissident leader Dudayev had been killed. Even after a peace treaty was signed in 1997, ending the First Chechen War, the status of Russia's breakaway republic remained unclear. In 1999 the battle over Chechnya's status was taken straight to the Russian capital of Moscow, where 5 bombings in 4 weeks claimed 300 lives. Islamic militants in Chechnya were blamed. The Kremlin responded with force, leveling Grozny by early 2000 and displacing 250,000 people from their homes. A pro-Moscow administration was put into place. Violence related to the Chechen conflict continued throughout Russia. Suicide bombings alone claimed more than 260 lives between 2002 and 2004. There were large-scale assaults as well. In October 2002, Chechen militants took more than 700 people hostage at a Moscow theater. After a 2-day standoff, Russian special forces stormed the building, killing 41 Chechen fighters and 129 hostages. In August 2004, 2 airliners crashed within minutes of each other after taking off from the same airport. 90 people died in the crashes, which Russian President Vladimir Putin, 1952, labeled terrorism. And on September 1, 2004, 32 armed militants seized an elementary school in Beslan, North Ossetia, a region bordering Chechnya. The terrorists held some 1,200 hostages for 48 hours. At which time Russian forces stormed the building. 335 people died, most of them children. Leaders of the Chechen nationalist movement distanced themselves from the terrorist acts, the responsibility for which were claimed by a militant Chechen Muslim group. Chechnya continued to be unstable, with Putin resolved to a hardline approach to the breakaway republic. In elections held in March 2003, voters reportedly approved a new constitution that declared Chechnya to be part of Russia. But critics found the election results irregular, with almost 96% of voters expressing support for the referendum. Months later, pro-Moscow leadership was elected in the person of Deputy Prime Minister Ramzan Kadyrov. Critics called it a puppet regime. In March 2005, Chechen nationalist leader Aslan Moskatov, 1951–2005, was killed in a Russian assault. His death was seen as a victory for Moscow. Moskatov, who had briefly been president. 1997–1999, of an independent Chechnya, was generally viewed as a moderate who believed an honest dialogue between the two sides could bring an end to the decade-long conflict.
What caused the Bosnian War?
To understand the war in Bosnia, 1992–95, it is important to review the history of Yugoslavia. Treaties at the end of World War I, 1914–18, dissolved the Austria-Hungarian Empire, creating separate nations of Austria and Hungary and dividing their former territory into three new countries: Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The various factions within the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes struggled for power. In 1929, King Alexander I, 1888–1934, an ethnic Serbian, dismissed the national parliament, did away with the constitution, 1921, and declared an absolute monarchy. He also changed the country's name to Yugoslavia. The government was then dominated by ethnic Serbs, who had settled in the region as early as the 7th century AD and were converted to Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, by the 9th century. But the Serbian authority was challenged by the nation's ethnic Croats, whose ancestors had settled in the region by the 7th century AD and were converted to Western Christianity, Roman Catholicism, by the Franks. To try to end the struggle, in 1939 Croats were given limited autonomy within Yugoslavia. The arrangement was short-lived. Yugoslavia was invaded by the Axis powers in April 1941 in World War II, 1939–45. The war over, in 1946 Yugoslavia was divided into 6 federated republics: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. But the lines of demarcation between these republics paid little regard to the ethnic boundaries of Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, who have been in the region since 1526, when it was invaded by Turks. Federal power was in the hands of communist leader Josip Broz Tito, 1892–1980. At first Tito tied his government to the Soviet Union. He directed the nationalization of land, industry, utilities, and natural resources. But after 1948 he pursued a policy of non-alignment. In the 1980s Yugoslavia's economy weakened, exacerbating regional differences. Tensions among ethnic groups flared. In 1991, as communism fell across Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia began to break apart. By March 1992 4 of its republics had declared independence. Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. What remained of Yugoslavia were Serbia and Montenegro. Serbs living in Bosnia and Herzegovina objected to the Declaration of Independence, which had been approved by the republic's Croats and Muslims. Fighting broke out in Bosnia. Cantered around the capital city of Sarajevo. Troops from Serbia entered the region to back the ethnic uprising in Bosnia. As with many civil wars, the conflict divided families and friends. Evidence mounted that the Serbs, under the direction of leader Radovan Karadzic, 1945, were engaged in a program of ethnic cleansing, including the mass murder of tens of thousands of Muslim refugees. In May 1995, after the Serbian military in Bosnia refused to comply with the United Nations, UN, ultimatum, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, began a campaign of strategic airstrikes on Serbian targets. The NATO assaults weakened the Serbs and brought them to the negotiating table in November 1995, when U.S. mediators helped broker a peace agreement in Dayton, Ohio. A single state, Bosnia and Herzegovina, was re-established. It was to be governed through a power-sharing arrangement among Serbs, Croats, and Muslims. But the conflict in Yugoslavia was not over. By 1998 the region's ethnic disputes erupted into another civil war, this time in the Kosovo province. In 2003 Yugoslavia was effectively dissolved with the establishment of the country of Serbia. And Montenegro through a peace accord brokered by officials from the European Union, EU. The new arrangement gave greater autonomy to each republic.
What is the Irish question?
The Irish question is an ages-old and very complicated problem that encompasses issues of land ownership, religion, and politics between Ireland and Britain. The chronology of events is, 12th century, a feudal landowning system is imposed on Ireland by the British, creating an absentee landlord class and an impoverished Irish peasantry. 1700s, the English try to impose Protestantism on a largely Catholic Ireland, Irish rebellions flare. 1801, the Act of Union unites England and Ireland, forming the United Kingdom. Though Ireland has representation in Parliament, it is divided. 1800s, the British Crown begins to populate the 6 counties of the northeastern Irish province of Ulster with Scottish and British settlers, giving the area a decidedly Protestant character. The division deepens between the 26 counties of Southern Ireland and Ulster. The north becomes increasingly industrialized and Protestant, while the south remains agricultural and Catholic. 1840s, Irish discontent with British rule heightens when a great famine strikes Ireland, resulting in widespread hunger, illness, and death. Many who survive emigrate to seek a better life elsewhere. 1858, a secret revolutionary society forms in Ireland and among Irish emigrants in the United States. Called the Fenian Movement, the group's objective is to achieve Irish independence from England by force. Fenians stage rebellions, which are suppressed by the British. 1868, the head of the Liberal Party, William Gladstone, 1809–1898, becomes British Prime Minister. He will be Prime Minister 3 more times during the last 4 decades of the century. Gladstone becomes an advocate for the peaceful settlement of the Irish question. 1870, Parliament passes the First Land Act, encouraging British landlords to sell land and providing reduced-rate loans to Irish tenants wishing to buy land. 1875, Irish nationalist leader C.S. Parnell, 1846–1891, enters British Parliament. He uses filibusters to prevent Parliament from discussing anything but the Irish question. 1886. C.S. Parnell forms an alliance with Prime Minister William Gladstone. The first Home Rule Bill, providing for Irish self-government, is introduced in Parliament but fails to pass. 1893, the second Home Rule Bill is introduced in Parliament. It is passed by the House of Commons but fails to be passed by the Lords. 1905, an Irish nationalistic movement called Sinn Féin, meaning we ourselves, forms under the leadership of Arthur Griffith, 1872–1922. The group seeks to establish an economically and politically independent Ireland. 1912, the Third Home Rule Bill is introduced in Parliament. Again, the House of Commons passes the legislation providing for Irish self-government. Fearing domination by Catholic Southern Ireland in the event of Irish Home Rule, there is agitation including threat of civil war in Ulster, Northern Ireland. To prevent the outbreak of violence, the Lords exclude Ulster Ireland from the provisions of the Home Rule Bill. It does not take effect due to continued unrest. 1916, refusing to accept the divided Ireland proscribed by the British Parliament, revolutionary Sinn Féin member Michael Collins. 1890–1922, organises a guerrilla movement led by the Irish Republican Army, IRA. The nationalist organisation becomes dedicated to the unification of Ireland. 1920, Parliament passes the Government of Ireland Act. establishing separate domestic legislatures for the North and South, as well as continued representation in British Parliament. The 6 northern counties of Ireland accept the Act and become Northern Ireland. The 26 southern counties refuse to accept the legislation. 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty is signed, providing for the 26 counties of Southern Ireland to become the Irish Free State, now the Republic of Ireland. 1922, the Irish Free State, headed by Sinn Féin leader Arthur Griffith, is officially declared. It gradually severs its ties to Britain. 1927, Sinn Féin ends as a movement, but some intransigent members join the IRA. And Sinn Féin becomes the political arm of the Irish Revolutionary Army. 1939–45, IRA violence and its pro-German stance cause both Irish governments to outlaw the organization, which goes underground. 1969, the IRA splits into an official majority, which disclaims violence, and a provisional wing, which stages attacks on British troops in Northern Ireland via random bombings and other terrorist acts. Still determined to forge a unified and independent Ireland, the IRA continues to stage acts of violence into the 1990s. At times, bombings become part of everyday life in Belfast, Northern Ireland. London is also the target of random IRA bomb attacks. June 6, 1996, Britain and Ireland agree on an agenda for multi-party peace negotiations on Northern Ireland, but finding ways to disarm Northern Ireland's rival guerrilla groups remains an obstacle to political settlement. April 10, 1998, a Good Friday Peace Accord is signed by Catholic and Protestant leaders who agree to form a multi-party administration by October. Disarmament will remain a sticking point to moving this agreement forward. May 22. 1998, 71% of voters in Northern Ireland vote for an agreement on a power-sharing government, which is also backed by 94% of the voters in the Republic of Ireland. The peace agreement is designed to heal the divisions between Catholics and Protestants that have left 3,400 dead, 40,000 injured, and millions of dollars of property damage. Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern, 1951, has a simple message for those who still aim to promote violence: forget it. The people on whose behalf you claim to act have spoken. Your ways are the ways of the past. August 15, 1998, violence is renewed when a car bomb in Omagh, Northern Ireland, kills 28 people and injures 220. The real IRA, a dissident faction of the Irish Republican Army, claims responsibility. October 16, 1998, the leaders of Northern Ireland's two main political parties win the Nobel Prize for their efforts to end 3 decades of religious-inspired violence in the British province. John Hume, 1937, a Catholic, heads the Social Democratic and Labour Party, whose membership is predominantly Roman Catholic. David Trimble, 1944, a Protestant, leads the Ulster Unionist Party, consisting of pro-British Protestants. December 1998, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953. Tries to jumpstart the stalled Good Friday peace agreement, Catholic and Protestant politicians have failed to set up the multi-party administration to which they had agreed. Leaders have been hampered in their efforts to do so by the question of disarmament. Protestants demand exclusion of the Sinn Féin party from government until its military wing, the IRA, disarms. Blair also presses for North-South bodies, committees that will oversee cooperation between the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland on matters of industry, tourism, and transportation. Blair insists that his government will hold all parties to a May 2000 disarmament deadline. 2000, the disarmament deadline is not met. October 23, 2001, the IRA promises to disarm in order to save the peace process. 2002, the peace process is suspended after police discover that the IRA is operating a spy ring inside Northern Ireland government offices. Sporadic violence continues. Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern and other major political figures in the Republic of Ireland move to distance themselves from Sinn Féin, the IRA's political arm. December 2004, Belfast's Northern Bank is robbed of $50 million the week before Christmas. The biggest heist in the history of British crime is believed to have been carried out by the IRA to fund its operations. Early 2005, despite the Good Friday Agreement, the IRA has not yet disarmed. According to news reports, IRA gunmen have become an increasingly mafia-like crime organization, involved in drug trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and the violence associated with those criminal activities. In a January 30 Belfast pub brawl, Robert McCartney, an amiable forklift operator, is murdered in what the perpetrators tell pub patrons is IRA business. Though witnesses are intimidated, McCartney's sisters are not. The 5 women demand that the IRA be held accountable for the slaying. The McCartney sisters are hailed as heroes for their courage to speak out against the IRA and are embraced by Sinn Féin. But Sinn Féin's electoral prospects dimmed in the aftermath of the murder. The event provides another roadblock to peace. July 2005, the IRA renounces the use of violence in its fight against British rule in Northern Ireland. The group vows to disarm and to use only peaceful means in its ongoing efforts. The announcement is widely hailed.
Why did Einstein write to President Roosevelt urging U.S. development of the atom bomb?
Albert Einstein, who was born in Germany in 1879 and was educated in Switzerland, where he also became a naturalized citizen, was an ardent pacifist. But, being a brilliant observer, he quickly perceived the threat posed by Nazi Germany. Einstein was visiting England in 1933 when the Nazis confiscated his property in Berlin and deprived him of his German citizenship. Some might call it lucky that the Nobel Prize-winning, 1921, scientist was out of the country. When this happened in the coming years, other Jews certainly suffered worse fates as Nazi Germany. Under despotic ruler Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945, persecuted and killed more than 6 million Jews. Einstein moved to the United States, where he took a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. There he settled and later became an American citizen, 1940. In August 1939, just before Adolf Hitler's German troops invaded Poland and began World War II. 1939–45, Einstein wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882–1945, urging him to launch a government program to study nuclear energy. He further advocated the United States build an atomic bomb, cautioning that such an effort might already be underway in Germany. The United States did in fact begin development of the atomic bomb, which releases nuclear energy by splitting heavy atomic particles. The program was called the Manhattan Project, and it was centered at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, where scientists worked to obtain sufficient amounts of plutonium and uranium to make the bombs. The bombs themselves were developed in a laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The project was funded by the government to the tune of $2 billion. The first atomic device, made of plutonium, was tested in Alamogordo, New Mexico. On July 16, 1945. And less than a month later the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima, August 6, and Nagasaki, August 9, Japan, forcing the Japanese to surrender. After the war, Einstein, who was always interested in world and human affairs, and had regretted the death and destruction in Japan, advocated a system of world law that he believed could prevent war in the atomic, or nuclear, age. A Zionist Jew, in 1952 he was offered the presidency of the relatively new State of Israel. Founded 1947, but he declined the honor. He died in New Jersey in 1955.
Why was the Mars Pathfinder project important?
The historical space project yielded a tremendous amount of data, even more than scientists had planned or hoped about the planet, totally reshaping many long-held notions about Mars, the fourth planet in the solar system. Pathfinder landed on Mars on July 4, 1997, and deployed a 2-foot-long robotic rover called Sojourner. The small rover collected what project scientists described as a staggering amount of data. 2.3 billion bits of information about the planet, 8.5 million measurements of temperature and pressure, 16 chemical analyses of rocks, soil, and other surface materials, and 16,500 pictures. Among other things, the new data caused scientists to rethink the planet's color. Long believed to be red, the color is now described as a deep amber or butterscotch. The evidence gathered by Sojourner supports the notion that there may have been life on Mars. Future projects aimed at studying the planet's properties will further explore the theory that there was once life on Mars. With the success of Pathfinder, project scientists turn their attention to improving the data gathering capabilities of future rovers, including the addition of brushes to the robot, so that dust can be collected from rocks on the surface of Mars, which is a distance of 155 million miles from Earth.
What were the Salem witch trials?
A series of trials in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, the proceedings against 200 people accused of witchcraft became allegory for searching out or harassing anyone who holds unpopular views. Indeed, the 19 hangings that resulted from the witch hunt provide students of history with a cautionary tale about the hazards of mass hysteria. In the 17th century, people widely believed in witchcraft and that those who wielded its supernatural power could perform acts of ill will against their neighbors. Courts somewhat regularly heard cases involving the malice of witches. Before the notorious trials of 1692, the records of colonial Massachusetts and Connecticut show that 70 witch cases had been tried, and 18 of the accused were convicted. But nothing had reached the scale of the 1692 witch hunt. In January of that year, the daughter and niece of a Reverend Samuel Parris began exhibiting strange behavior. Upon examination by a doctor, the conclusion was that the young girls, ages 9 and 11, were bewitched. Compelled to name those who had bewitched them, the girls named a Carib Indian slave who worked in the minister's home, and 2 other women, one a derelict and the other an outcast. They were arrested. Hearings were held and others were accused, including upstanding members of the community whose only crime seemed to be their opposition to Reverend Parris. Members of his congregation became corroborative witnesses. By May, jails in Salem and Boston were filled with suspected witches awaiting trial. The court, now with a docket of some 70 cases, convened on June 28. Through the summer months and into September, 50 of the accused confessed to practicing witchcraft, 26 were convicted, and 19 were executed. The colonial governor of Massachusetts became alarmed by the number of convictions. He ordered the Salem court to disband and commenced hearings of the remaining cases in a superior court. Of 50 still accused, the court indicted only 23. Of these, there were only 3 convictions, all of which were overturned. In 1693 the colonial governor pardoned those whose cases were still pending and declared that witchcraft was no longer an actionable offense.
How were the southern states brought back into the Union?
Even before the Civil War had ended, Washington, D.C. considered the difficult problem of how to rejoin the seceding states with the North. Some lawmakers felt the southern states should be treated as if they were territories that were gained through war. Others, including both Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, and Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, reasoned that since secession was illegal, the South belonged and always had to the Union, and therefore the states ought to be brought back into their proper relationship with the federal government. They favored punishing the Southern leaders but not the states themselves. President Abraham Lincoln developed his 10% plan. As soon as 10% of a state's population had taken an oath of loyalty to the United States, the state would be allowed to set up a new government. But Congress opposed it, proclaiming the policy too mild, and responded by passing the Wade-Davis Bill. June 1864, making the requirements for statehood more rigid. Instead of Lincoln's 10%, Congress required that a majority of voters in each state would need to swear their loyalty in an ironclad oath, before statehood could be restored. Further, the bill stipulated that the Constitution of each state had to abolish slavery and that Confederate military leaders were to be prohibited from holding political office and otherwise disenfranchised. Lincoln opposed the bill and neither signed nor returned it before Congress was dismissed. And so the Wade-Davis measure failed to become law. When Lincoln was assassinated the following April, the matter remained unsettled. His successor, President Andrew Johnson, soon put forth a plan to readmit the states. He called for each state constitution to abolish slavery and repudiate the Confederate war debt. Further, a majority of voters in each state needed to vow allegiance to the Union. Once a state had reorganized itself under this plan, Johnson required the state legislature to approve the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in the United States. When Congress reconvened in December 1865 for the first time since Lincoln's assassination, all former Confederate states except Texas had complied with the President's specifications for statehood. But these new states had also set up black codes, severely restricting the rights of blacks. Further, there was violence against blacks who were the victims of attacks by white Southerners, including members of the newly formed Ku Klux Klan, a secret white organization that spread terror across the South. Congress became determined to fight the readmission of the Southern states by Johnson's lenient standards, and it refused to seat any representatives from the South. The move angered President Johnson, and political volleying between the legislature and the executive office began. Ultimately, it was Congress that determined the process by which the Southern states were readmitted. By the summer of 1868, the legislatures of 7 of 11 Southern states had approved the 14th Amendment. The remaining 4 states, Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia, complied with the requirements for statehood by 1870, at which time the Union was restored, and congressional representatives from the South were again welcomed in Washington. In the intervening period, between Congress's rejection of President Johnson's plan for statehood and the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, the South was governed by military administrators who protected people and property and oversaw the reorganization of government in each state.
Did Newton invent calculus?
Yes, Newton did invent calculus. But so did German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, independently of Newton. Both men had developed calculus in the context of trying to explain the laws of physics. Newton's development of calculus predated that of Leibniz, but he failed to publish it. Leibniz published his results in 1684, Newton followed suit in 1693. Each used different symbols and notations. But Leibniz's were considered superior and were more widely adopted, causing friction between the men. Their conflict became a matter of national pride, with English scientists refusing to accept Leibniz's version. Nevertheless, since Newton's system predated that of Leibniz, he is credited as the originator.
How damaging were the California wildfires of 2003?
The wildfires that raged in Southern California in late 2003 were the most damaging in the state's history. 15 fires destroyed 3,000 homes, burned 750,000 acres, caused more than 200 injuries, and claimed 24 lives. The fires produced one of the worst disasters the state had ever seen. The wildfires began October 21 and, driven by Santa Ana winds, swept through wooded canyons and mountain communities in Los Angeles, Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego, and Ventura counties. On October 27, President Bush declared a disaster area, clearing the way for federal assistance. Firefighters worked into early November to bring the blazes under control. The fires had forced mandatory evacuations and caused widespread air pollution. Damages were estimated between $2.50 and $3 billion. Although Southern California was devastated by the emergency, and the western wildfires were in the national headlines, the 2003 fire season was, on the whole, about average. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, NIFC, 85,943 fires burned in U.S. wildlands during the 2003 season. The 10-year average, 1993 to 2002, was 101,575 fires per season. The number of acres burned in 2003 was 4,918,088, with a 10-year average of 4,663,081 acres per season. The 2004 fire season burned almost 2 million acres more than in 2003. But the NIFC acknowledged that the number of structures destroyed was above average in 2003, a total of 5,781 structures were burned, including 4,090 primary residences, leaving many homeless. Federal agencies alone spent $1.3 billion to suppress wildfires across the United States in 2003, considerably higher than the 10-year average.
What were Captain Cook's discoveries?
British navigator Captain James Cook, 1728 to 1779, was one of the world's greatest explorers. Commanding 3 voyages to the Pacific Ocean and sailing around the world twice. From 1768 to 1771, aboard the ship Endeavour, Cook conducted an expedition to the South Pacific, where he landed in Tahiti, and made the first European discovery of the coasts of New Zealand, Australia, and New Guinea, which he also charted. In 1772 Cook set out to find the great southern continent that was believed to exist. He spent 3 years on this voyage, which edged along the ice fields of Antarctica. On his last voyage, which he undertook in 1776 on a mission to find a passage around North America from the Pacific, Cook charted the Pacific coast of North America as far north as the Bering Strait. He met his death in 1778 on the Hawaiian Islands. Cook's voyages led to the establishment of Pacific Ocean colonies by several European nations.
What was Roman law?
It was the system of law used by the Romans from the 8th century B.C. until the fall of the empire, Rome, in the West Roman Empire, was toppled in AD 476, the East Empire fell in AD 1453. Justinian the Great, 483 to 565, the emperor of the East Roman Empire, is credited with codifying, writing and organizing Roman law by ordering the collection of all imperial statutes and of all the writings of the Roman jurists, judges and other legal experts. Justinian appointed the best legal minds in the empire to assemble, write, publish, and update the code. Work began in and continued until the time of Justinian's death in 565. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, body of civil law, also called the Justinian Code. It consists of 4 parts: the Codex, a collection of imperial statutes; the Digest, the writings and interpretations of Roman jurists; the Institutes, a textbook for students; and the Novels, the laws enacted after the publication of the Codex. Though largely suspended during the Middle Ages, 500-1350, it was kept alive in the canon law of the medieval church and was handed down through the centuries. It forms the basis of modern civil law in most of continental Europe and in other non-English speaking countries, as well as in the state of Louisiana. Nations or states whose systems of justice are based on civil law rely not on precedents set by the courts, which is the common law system of the United States and Great Britain, but rather on the letter of the law, the statutes themselves.